Good afternoon, Frank. As
Hello,
usual,
Professor.
things are getting more and more exciting all the time. And I've been wondering recently how to make sense of all this since there's so much to talk about and we need to make sense of it in terms of globalization. And it's one thing to repeat all the things we've said before about the way globalization works and use these new things as just examples. But we need to be building on what we understand about the forces that are pushing globalization forward and creating the problems. After all, globalization should be positive, isn't it? Shouldn't we want it to be positive? Why all these problems? And it occurs to me that what we have, I think I may have said before that I see a tension all the time between the need for order and the opportunities for new things. And if you go after new things, then you break up the order that everybody had been relying on. And now I see that as a problem that is created by the fact that social change works faster than cultural change. So
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
yes, that's
All
what
right. All
I'm
right.
trying to do. That we've already said that we wouldn't have globalization if we hadn't been having accelerating population growth over the recent past. But population growth on its own wouldn't cause globalization. What causes globalization is more and more people interacting with each other more intensively all the time, which they seem to choose to do. Just look at Facebook, for example, and all these other social media. They're very popular and they get more and more popular and more complex. That's social change. That is more and more people interacting with each other more intensively all the time and choosing to do so. What they actually have in their heads when they're doing it and how their mental furniture changes as a result of what they have in their heads, what they're thinking, and how they interpret things would be cultural change.
Uh-huh.
But cultural change generally is where we maintain our ordered idea of the stochastic events around us. So in fact, although as we interact more intensively all the time, the rate of cultural change does increase, and America has changed more over the last generation than in previous generations, I think, although it's difficult to prove this sort of thing because cultural change is much less easy to measure than other types of change. I mean, the easiest type of change to measure obviously is economics because it's all in figures and you can see whether the figures are higher or lower than here. However, social change is entirely out of our control, except to the extent that we can impose birth control, but we're not very good at doing that anyway. Cultural change is also out of our control, except that we're so concerned to have order in our lives that we are, what shall I say, we're very careful about changing the way we think about things. Because it disrupts what's going on around us and makes it more difficult for us to know what to expect. And if we don't know what to expect, we get into psychological difficulty. And actually, it's been occurring to me recently also that, quite apart from what we have in the news that we have to talk about, that the demand for psychological or psychiatric treatment, I'm sure, has been increasing under globalization. But that's something maybe we should come back to some other time.
Well,
Anyway, if you look at each of these problematic situations in the world today, whether it's Ukraine or it's Libya, which now that Gaza has settled for a while, at any rate, Libya and Ukraine seem to be the places in the most serious difficulty. I think this helps us to understand what's going on.
well, in a funny way, it's almost analogous to social change being almost a random access memory in a computer. And in the cultural change, or the cultural foundation is sort of the operating system. So what's happening is that there's a lot of noise. I think historically, I mean, depending upon your vantage point in history, wherever you are, you always think, my goodness, there's so much cultural or so much social change noise going on. It could have been way back when Gutenberg invented the printing press. People say, oh my goodness, look at this now. No matter what it was, the phone, the telegraph, newspapers, people, I suspect, always think that they're at the center of a maelstrom, of a tidal wave of social change. But I think it's when the impact occurs with the cultural governing system, that's when you begin to get the kind of bumping that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, it's interesting you introduced the printing, because that standardized communication over such enormous areas and created really the prelude to modernity. That it was printing that changed us over from what we look back on as medieval and what we look back on as early modern.
I'll point out another thing before we discuss the topic of events, if you will, and you sort of opened the door a little bit when you spoke about the presumed increase in psychological treatment going on these days. And a very interesting point is that it's a well-known human therapeutic rule that people don't seek to improve or rebuild their lives until they've hit rock bottom, until they've reached a position of hopelessness and begin to realize that they need to work their way back up toward the light, if you excuse my metaphor. And I'm just wondering, since cultures and societies are simply nothing more than collections of people or their recollections, is that something that we dare extrapolate out, wondering whether or not that something like that is going to have to happen on a much more broad scale than just one or two people acting together? I mean, I don't know. I just thought about that. So,
Well, it's certainly the sort of thing that we could talk about at great length, because so many things that are revolutionary in society begin at the level of individual behavior, impression, illness, and then as the number of cases of individual incapacity or disability rise, at some point you get to the situation where it disrupts the way the society works as a whole, and the society has to be reorganized. And we have some very interesting models of this sort of thing in anthropology that you may have come across before, that help us to understand how new religions arise. Or it's one thing for somebody to preach a new religion, but why does anybody pay attention to them? Obviously, because they need a new message, because they need to reorganize society. And that's when it takes off.
well, have we not often talked about reorganizing society?
Yeah, we have, and of course there's a group of people in Syria and Iraq who are trying to do it right now.
This is true. This is true.
And one person has already suggested to me that the Islamic State may be a new version of what we in the past have called a revitalization movement. That is an effort to reorganize society with a new religious message that works at a time when people's concern about how they stand in the old society has got to the point where something new can take off.
Well, I think Caliph Baghdadi would agree with you.
Well, I don't know, but then you've got to decide what actually was wrong with Syria in 2009, was it, when things began to fall apart there?
Right.
And after all, it had been working fairly well since Assad took over, and his son seems to have been able to, somewhat unexpectedly, continue the same pattern. But then all of a sudden, it seemed as though the move to change things in Syria was not something that was internally generated so much as people following what was going on in the other so-called Arab Spring countries. And that's wrong. Maybe it was an internal problem in Syria that just happened to happen at the same time. And maybe throughout the Islamic world, things have got to roughly the same stage at the same time.
Well, all I know is that any place you look in the Middle East, it's like one headline after another that is almost unforeseeable. I mean, and the most amazing thing I've seen this week is the fact that the air forces of the United Arab Emirates are flying 1,500 miles to the west to bomb Libya, and then flying back. So I mean, I took out my little aviation application on the internet to see what countries they must be flying over. So they're flying over Saudi Arabia, of course. They're flying over parts of Syria, presumably which don't have any anti-aircraft missiles. And then they're flying to the south and crossing over Egypt before they get to Libya.
They can't go just by going over Saudi Arabia and Egypt?
Well, they end up skirting parts of southern Syria, or in this case, eastern Syria.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't know the route they took, but if you look at the air traffic route, that's the route they would take.
Hmm.
But that's quite an extraordinary undertaking on their part.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, we don't know what sort of negotiations are going on that lead to this sort of activity between the states involved. The Libyan case is particularly interesting because it seems as though the old system has broken down, but there's no charismatic leader with a new message to promote a new system. And so the three parts of Libya, Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan, may be in the same situation as
Iraq.
Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and southern Iraq, the three Ottoman provinces that became Iraq. And this is obviously what one would expect as the consequences of the way England and France, and to some extent Italy, I suppose, imposed a new order, national order on the region nearly 100 years ago.
What do you think? I mean, it seems now, and the president is speaking right now, actually, and he's talking about the most recent actions in Ukraine, where apparently everybody from NATO on down has confirmed that Russian military forces are on the move and have crossed the border. And I take it Putin no longer cares about sanctions or criticism. What do you think he's doing?
I think he has an agenda that we don't understand. And I think that there's absolutely no negotiation going on about the relationship between the Western point of view, the Russian point of view, and the Western point of view. And each is trying to promote their own idea of what the future of that threshold zone between Russia and Western Europe should be. Eastern Europe has, after all, for quite a number of centuries been a problem area between the Franco-German part of Europe and the Russian part of Europe. And the current situation was imposed again, like the Middle East, after the First World War. And probably can't last, because each of the countries is supposed to be a national community, but has serious problems with minorities.
Right. Well, go ahead.
That's, I think, what's going on. And the Western idea about how to solve these problems is totally different from the Russian idea. And we think we have the moral high ground, but I'm not sure that our evidence for that is as good now as it might have been 50 years ago. So while I don't like Putin's tactics and I'm against the use of force anyway, I'm puzzled by the way the West is going about it.
Well, as you've been noting since the beginning of this crisis, I mean, no one, it seems, who's reporting this has gone back through the history books to point out the historical antecedents that are involved here.
Yeah.
So it's an unfortunate situation. Possibly no one has bothered to brief the Western leaders, although I can't believe that.
Well, the Western leaders, unlike American presidents, are fairly well educated.
Yes, they are.
Um, because they've gone through a long training. They haven't just suddenly run for president without going through a long party
Culling
background.
process. Yes, yes.
So I really don't understand why there's not more discussion of this. Even in magazines like The Atlantic, I've seen nothing like this.
Can we go back to ISIS for a second then?
Yeah.
The Americans, I think, are edging closer to some actually outright boots on the ground, and at least a supporting role, I think. What do you think is going to happen there? And the other thing, when you pointed something out, I never really realized this, but when you talked about the Arab Spring in 2009, which led to all of the roiling, if you will, I wonder how much of that, if any, historically, when people look back, is going to be able to be traced to the American intervention in Iraq and taking down Saddam Hussein. I'm wondering if somewhere Colin Powell isn't saying, well, this is what I said when I met my Pottery Barn analogy. If you break it, you own it. This maybe all stems from that in some way.
I think it would be difficult to argue against that. So maybe we should stop putting so much emphasis on Sykes and Picot and point out that Sykes and Picot took over to begin with, and then whatever order that managed to bring about was once again broken up by the invasion in 2003. So we're dealing with, in each one of these countries, we're dealing with situations that were imposed from outside. And because of the way globalization progresses, with the rise of awareness and people making up their own minds what to do more and more, rather than doing what they were, the social arrangements around them seem to make them want to do, the more these things are being questioned.
And so we're talking about intervening events by outside forces.
Whether it's going to be boots on the ground or drones, I'm not sure. My impression is that drones are the favored.
Right. But I guess my point is that as the West or whomever are making these unilateral intrusions, forcing these cultural changes in the cultural order, it's almost as if the situation occurs in reverse. Rather than the social change leading to the social change, leading to the cultural change, they go in and root out the cultural changes first, whether it be a government shift or a combination or conflation of various states into one sovereign entity, and then they leave the people to catch up to it.
I think that the situation won't be resolved until the people have the opportunity to work it out for themselves.
I agree.
It's not possible to impose another solution from the outside, and and as history progresses, it becomes less and less possible. So I think that any effort to do this from the outside with drones is just going to extend the problem and make it worse. However, if we were to withdraw entirely, I'm not suggesting that would make everything better overnight. But the people on the ground there and the local leaders of each country there have to come to some sort of general agreement about how things should be organized. We're waiting to see what Erdogan is going to do as the new president of Turkey, because of the speculation that he's trying to turn it into an executive presidency.
He did say he plans to follow the EU lines, so he made that announcement earlier today. I don't know if that's just a comfort statement or not.
Oh,
So
okay. Is our time up?
our time is up. All right, Professor, we'll talk next week. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right,
Bye.
bye.